Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Aparutade sangamatasa tawara ye sodavanta bamunjantu satang. So this afternoon, this is opportunity to reflect, to contemplate Dhamma, the reality of here and now. So I encourage you to relax, have a relaxed attention, even though relaxation and attention sound like opposites. Then in conscious awareness here and now. So it's a listening, the sense of open receptivity. It's peaceful and uncreated, where ideas about effort and paying attention as an order, as a command, can create all kinds of stress. Relaxation can be considered just taking it easy and not paying attention, total relaxation, just not caring, but relaxing and attentive relaxing, we begin to have this sense of being at ease with Dhamma here and now, because ultimately Dhamma is here and now. It's not something you're going to get in the future or that you learn. It's like this. Many years ago I gave a winter's retreat using the Paticca Samuppada, the dependent origination teaching, as a text for the, I think it was only 2 months then, but it's a teaching that when I first came across it, before I really had developed any kind of meditation practice, didn't make any sense at all to a Western mindset and Western way of thinking. One doesn't connect the concepts in the dependent origination in the same way you do when you investigate Paticca Samuppada, dependent origination. So also those of you who come from European, Western cultural conditions, coming across Buddhism, oftentimes it seems not to make any sense, or you don't quite connect the meaning of the word, so it sounds very complicated. I remember at that time thinking Paticca Samuppada was very complicated, but it's ultimately very simple when you begin to understand how to use it. So it starts out with avijja, vajjaya sankhara, and that's the beginning. When we chant it, we say avijja vajjaya sankhara. What does that mean? Avijja vajjaya sankhara. So avijja is not understanding Dhamma, not knowing, not realizing, not recognizing reality, ultimate reality. And so the sakyaditthi, the ego, the sense of a separate self is avijja. So as long as we identify with the physical body and see ourselves as a personality. And whatever name you identify with, your Christian name, Buddhist name, European or Asian name, this applies to the form that we cling to. So that is a basic avijja, or avijja in Pali means ignorance, or not knowing reality itself, not knowing Dhamma. So that affects sankharas, which are phenomena, the phenomena that we identify with. So what the phenomena we identify with is the body and the mental states of memories, the appearance, the cultural conditioning, religious conditioning, all conditioning. If we learn even Buddhism from the avijja level, without investigating Dhamma, without understanding what that actually is in reality, not just kind of philosophical concepts or metaphysical ideals, but it's beginning to awaken to this avijja affects conditioning, all conditioned phenomena, which are sankharas, which is the world that we live in, the world that we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, that we interpret always from avijja, from me and mine. Whether we like it, don't like it, agree with it, don't agree with it, whether we have prejudices or biases, cultural views, that are clung to, and we tend to approach life always from seeing everything through avijja. Bhajya sankhara, sankhara bhajya vijnana. So that the reality of consciousness is affected by avijja. So what we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, think through the body and through the senses is always interpreted with avijja, or the personal view. So that's why we think the world is, my worldview is the right view, or about me as a separate person with feelings of loneliness or neglect or ambition, trying to become the emperor of the world or a famous celebrity, or just settling down to just ordinary life as we live it in modern society, as a person, as a separate entity. And so that is, consciousness then operates just through the senses. We see everything as separate. So avijja bhajya sankhara, sankhara bhajya vijnana, vijnana bhajya namarupa. And that in consciousness, which is unitive, is then divided into form and space. So then namarupa, name and form, which it becomes more complicated as the ayatanas, or the six senses, are affected by that divisive thinking process. I am my name, I am my form, I identify with these ways of expression. I am a condition, I am a person, I am an individual. So this is in monastic life. We notice how we use avijja to interpret our experience as monks or nuns. We can just live completely within the Vinaya discipline and sitting practices of meditation, bhavana, and never break through the basic delusion of avijja. So monastic forms just become more attachments, identities that we like or don't like, agree with or don't agree with, appreciate or despise. So notice how complicated it gets. Avijja complicates everything. Ignorance of Dhamma makes life incredibly complicated, as it goes from the basic avijja to sankhara to consciousness to the division of nama-rupa and the salayatanas, the six senses. Now it's six senses operating from avijja. And this creates desire and clinging. So we start, we cling to, most people never question the experience of life in any way. They operate from avijja. That's why the world that we hear about, through the news, through the media, is always so confused. Some of the terrible things going on now, just in the Middle East and the COVID pandemic and so forth, endless wars, conflicts, disagreements, divorces, quarrels, and political problems that are common in every country, every place, because it's based, all these conditions come from avijja, from biases, from prejudices, from personal preferences. So how can we find world peace or permanent happiness through this complexity of change? That's a question I've often asked myself before I became a monk, was how can, the world seems so confused. And the world that I created, which I thought was the real world, was very confused. So I remember referring to my student days in Berkeley when I joined peace movements. I joined 2 peace movements to bring peace to the world. I thought the United Nations, after the Second World War, when they established the UN, that you could solve all the problems of wars and that through just reason and logic, that's all I trusted in at the time. Everybody agreed, get along, learn to cooperate as a world organization. But you hear stories about the UN always in conflict with internally, because different countries, different nationalities, different worldviews still operate from avijja, produce endless misunderstandings, fears, anxiety, prejudices. So when desire arises, then we tend to grasp it, which is upadana, the Pali word for grasping or clinging. Because that's all we know how to do, operating from avijja, is clinging to our perceptions, to our conditioning. So that's why it's sometimes very difficult to understand each other, even though we might speak the same language, because we can't figure out why you think the way you do or act the way you do when it isn't reasonable according to my views, my world views that comes from avijja, contrary to your world views that come from avijja. So how can we help to have endless conflicts in terms of the sankharas that come from avijja? So clinging creates rebirth. Clinging to desire, you become what you cling to. So it's a sense of becoming. Rebirth, it can be seen as rebirth, which leads to old age, sickness, death, grief, sorrow, despair, and anguish. So that's the world that we create out of avijja, ignorance of Dhamma. Dhamma is the deathless, ultimate reality. So we don't know that. All our thoughts, all our memories, all our experience in life is based on ignorance of Dhamma. So when I chanted before I started this reflection, Aparutade Sangamata Satawara, the gate to the deathless, the door to the deathless is open. That's it's a nice sentiment in its own way, but what does it mean? What is the deathless? What is the metaphor of gates or the door? What does that mean? Is there a door? Are there gates? In reality, is they're looking for a door or a gate or an entrance to the deathless through the senses, which operate from avijja, which separate and divide and assess whether they're good, bad, right, or wrong. And so that's the whole rebirth process. We're reborn constantly according to what we're clinging to. We think we're a kind of permanent personality from day one to the end of our lives, the same person, because the body, even though it grows up, gets old, gets sick, and eventually dies, is what we're obsessed with, blinded by, operate from these perceptions. Cultural conditioning, very strong. So suffering is the result of this ignorance. So if there's avijja, there's going to be suffering. If there's this blind clinging to conditioned phenomena as oneself, separate self, how can there not be suffering? Even moments of happiness change. When we have peak moments in life where everything is the way we want it and we feel happy and fulfilled, it's going to change because old age starts making its presence very obvious, and sickness, COVID, pandemic, loss of loved ones, wars and destruction that we hear about or we experience through our forms, then even at the very peak moments of sankhara experience is still this fear, isn't it? It's not going to stay there. Remember, the peak is the top of a condition. And when it reaches its peak, then it changes to the opposite. So just through this kind of reflection, especially investigate clinging to sankharas, upadana, this sense of identity, whether you call it clinging or attachment or identity to sankharas. What does that really mean? Because it's not taught in the Western mindset, Western culture, even Western religion. Clinging to sankharas, what does that mean? Desire is, we can see it in terms of sexual desire or But when we say somebody has a lot of desires, it means they're very greedy for something, sensual objects, sensual experiences. In the limitations of the English language, but in the Pali Dhamma, which is the desire in Pali, it includes wanting to get rid of fear and anger and greed, wanting to become some kind of ideal that you imagine, wanting to become, like the enlightenment is perfection, or the arahant is the ultimate sign of perfection in terms of how we interpret, in the way that we interpret those terms. But sankharas cannot, they're not perfect because they're always flawed, they're always changing. Dhamma is perfect because it is changeless, and the gates to the deathless are open. So this was a pronouncement made by the Buddha after enlightenment. Now these are questions to ask yourself, not to just seek answers to your questions through other teachers or religious texts or philosophers or psychology, but to trust yourself to investigate what is desire like. Can you observe desire when you have sensual desires, when you have desires, ambitions to become, you have desires to get rid of your defilements? We all desire on a personal level to get rid of fear, self-consciousness. This sense of separate identity makes you separate from everything. You don't have the reality of union and perfection of Dhamma, because every identity, everything that you believe and hold to, that you love and hate, is a sankhara. So the first two noble truths, the suffering and its causes, is this anuloma practice where you investigate avijja, bhajaya, sankhara, sankhara bhajaya, vijnana, vijnana bhajaya, nama rupa bhajaya, salayatana, and onward. Passa, and then vedana, then upadana. So it's all written out in this particular teaching, which I found very helpful in just as an exercise in investigating what do these terms mean. And in those days, when I was looking for how to figure out Paticca Samuppada, there was nothing really available in English. So you had various views and opinions about it that I remember in the Word of the Buddha, Jnanatiloka's book that I value a lot. I gave up trying to figure it out from his way of reflecting. It's about rebirth. And so then rebirth tends to be about previous lives, reincarnation or whatever, in previous life I was such and such, and I was born in this life and the next life to be reborn again, and so I can realize Dhamma and become a Buddha in the next life. So is it just a kind of philosophy, kind of theory, a philosophical theory? Even on that level, it's quite good, but it's much more than that. It's not meant to be a theoretical teaching based on the intellect, but it's for this investigation. The other side, the third and fourth noble truths, Nirodha and the path, are the Bhattiloma side, where everything ceases. The ignorance ceases. Avijja ceases. Ignorance is gone. Therefore, all these attachments, identities, beliefs, fears, hopes, desires, good, bad, right or wrong, collapse. That's Nirodha, where suddenly everything, the whole world that we believed in, that we created through avijja, is gone. It doesn't mean it disappears, that we all kind of vanish from sight. But the belief, the blind belief, the attachments we form out of conditioning, that's gone. So that is peace, nibbana, freedom. The big fear about anatta is if there's no self, then there's nothing. And so, Buddhism can sound very nihilistic if it's just interpreted intellectually. But notice that there's always this Bhariyati, Bhati, and Bhati-wait sequence. It's a reflective teaching. So Bhariyati Dhamma is the scriptures, so that's where we start from. Those are the Four Noble Truths of Paticca Samuppada, dependent origination. That's Bhariyati Dhamma. Bhati Dhamma is practicing with it, so it's pointing. The Bhariyati Dhamma is a pointer, they're not doctrines. They're not imperatives to believe in them. Because the bhati or pavana practice, if the sign's pointing in a direction, the arrow's pointing that way, you look that way. You don't look at the sign. You don't just grasp the sign. Signs pointing to London when you're driving a car. You go to New Hemel Hempstead, you see the word London written on a sign. That's what we cling to if we're ignorant. In terms of Dhamma, we grasp the Bhariyati teachings only, so we never reach Nibbana, never realize Dhamma. You never get to London if you just satisfy yourself with a sign, and the sign doesn't seem, after a while, it's pretty boring. How long can you look at a sign pointing to the M1 saying London? It's ridiculous, isn't it? Or like a cookbook you read, but you never prepare the food. You go hungry. So much of, that Luang Por Chah used to point to in Thai Buddhism was the fact that there's so much Bhariyati Dhamma. Emphasize the scriptures, the Pali language, and the chanting and ceremonies. It's like clinging to the sign pointing to London. So, of course, if you just read a cookbook, you might memorize all the recipes, and that's impressive. but it doesn't feed you, doesn't nourish you till you prepare the food. And that's patipata. And the result is, once you prepare the food and eat it, then that satisfies the suffering, that gets rid of the suffering, the hunger. And as you practice the Dhamma, looking in the right direction, going in the right direction, which is here and now. So it's not like someplace off, like London, is far away. When we think of our places here and now, then where is London? It's how many miles away? It's not about going anywhere, but recognizing that these forms, this human form, this body, these thoughts, these memories, these are all conditions created out of avijja, the identity with them. Ask yourself, are you really just a human body? Is that all you're meant to be in life? Is you born to grow up, get old, and die? Eat food? Looking at the squirrels that run outside in the garden on my kuti, They spend their whole days looking for food and mating. Is that all, maybe that's all we're meant to be doing. Procreating the species and surviving. You have to eat food to survive. The body needs nourishment. So most of us that come to Amaravati have this feeling that there's something much more to it than just being born to grow up, get old, and drop dead at the age of 100. If you're lucky, or if you're unlucky, it depends on how you feel. So, like the Buddha pointed to ultimate reality, not to some ideal physical realm, utopian state. Even the Deva realms, which are very desirable realms, when you read about all the different levels of devas and brahmas, and that's creating images of perfection, of beauty, of lasting beauty, of happiness and bliss forever. But all these deva realms, brahma realms, are in consciousness. What's the consciousness of a devata, or a human being, or a gorilla? Is it different? Is a gorilla's consciousness coarse, and the consciousness of Paranimit Vasavati Deva very refined? Does consciousness have refinement or coarseness? In terms of appearance, there's a coarse, like the animal world, the Preta realm, the hungry ghosts, the hellish realms, they're all in the coarse level of sankharas. So they're really, when we talk about avijja hell, it's the most horrible hell you can possibly think or imagine in any individual's mind. Burning for eternity in fire and still being alive. For eternity, that's forever. In terms of how we interpret burning in hell fires for eternity, is anything more undesirable or more scary than that image? But that is images we create with our thoughts, our minds. That's not reality, that's not Dhamma. That's sankhara created through avijja. And then the deva realms, the Brahma realms, perfect beauty, lasting forever, permanent happiness forevermore, endless time, eternity, time that goes on forever and ever, is an image we create in our mind. It's a belief that time is, there's eternal time. But time is in sankhara. Times are all about sankharas. But here and now, Paccuppanna Dhamma is where eternity is, every moment, every breath, here and now, because it is eternal. It's unchangeable, immutable. Whether it's in a gorilla or one of us or a Brahma God, whatever, how refined or how coarse the conditions might be, consciousness doesn't have any quality about refinement or coarse. It's perfect. Coarseness and refinement are about conditioned phenomena. So it's just to put in the context in the Buddhist teaching, pointing to the way things are, all conditions are impermanent. And that's from the highest Brahma God to the most miserable of each hell. The human being is in the middle of all that, between the Brahma realms and the Avicii hell, because we can understand Avicii hell, can't we? We've had moments where we feel we're going to be miserable, totally miserable forever, that life is pointless and I'm a hopeless case and there's nothing to do but kill myself, and the desire to annihilate yourself. Is a hell realm we create just by thinking in the very negative terms: hopelessness, fear. All we're born for, meaning of our lives, just to grow up, get old, and die, to look for food, survive, and procreate the species. That's a rather cynical attitude towards humanity. But there's this other possibility that the Buddha pointed to: awaken to the reality of the here and now. And just by investigating time, because we go by clocks, calendars, schedules, all about time. Seniority, age. Time is the reality of the worldly dhammas. The worldly dhammas arise and cease. They're like waves or ripples on the ocean. They come from consciousness and they cease in consciousness, just like waves, no matter how big or small they might appear. It's just water. So all the sankharas, the ayatanas, all the whole world that we believe is our reality is about old age, sickness, death, change, incessant, inexorable change in us that is the very nature of sankharas. It's about time, space, Space is another important reflection, because it's here and now, and you can actually observe it just by looking. We call it space. We say the temple is spacious. We might have a little cubicle for a room. We think there's no space. So we judge space by the forms in it, the size of the forms, the temple, the size of the cell in the prison. And these are how we observe and relate to space. But space has no limit. It's immeasurable. And it's here and now, wherever you are, whatever posture, sitting, standing, walking, lying down, space is always here and now, it's always visible. And it has no dimensions, it has no quality or character other than spaciousness. And then consciousness is here and now. But you can't see it. You can't objectify it. Like space, you can just notice it by looking, seeing with your eyes. Consciousness, try to find consciousness as an object. You can't do it, it's impossible, it's not objective. But you know you're conscious. And this knowing, then we tend to identify consciousness with the body. So everybody believes that the consciousness is inside the body, including many scientists and psychologists. Consciousness is a mystery. Where is it? Does consciousness depend on the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body? Does consciousness arise through eyes, through ears, through hearing, through smelling, tasting, touching, thinking, feeling? Or does seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking, feeling arise in consciousness? These are questions to ask yourself. They're investigatory questions. They're not answers to consciousness. But to investigate reality here and now, it is conscious investigation, observing, witnessing, paying attention. So consciousness is here and now. Space is here and now. Avijja, as long as we operate from avijja, then here and now doesn't have any, you can't, define it. Because the thinking process is all about the past and the future. You can't define here and now as some quality, as something good or bad. It's like this. You begin to awaken to the reality of conscious awareness. And now, without we're not trying to find it as an object, but to realize it. It's like this. Not something to find in the future or to investigate through the intellect, but to trust So this is the gate or the door to the deathless. Yesodavantaba munjantu satang is the other half of that quote. Trust in this, awareness, mindfulness, conscious awareness, to be the witness, to be not somebody being a witness. You know, I think of if I'm the witness of sankharas, there's witnessing, which is noticing the way things are, knowing that all sankharas are impermanent. Knowing sankharas, that's an exotic word for most people, Pali word. Phenomena or conditions, the born, the created, the form, the condition. So when we attach to conditions out of ignorance, the result, the cause of attachment to ignorance, the result of that is grief, sorrow, despair, and anguish, old age, sickness, and death. So I mean, that's pretty miserable, you know. That's the depressing side of life. When we see the world only in terms of the conditioning we've received, the ego or the cultural conditioning, then you had no choice in choosing. When you're born, you know, a newborn baby takes in what's ever available. But this awakening or enlightenment is seeing the way things are. Knowing. There's knowing, but there's no knower. So you might describe consciousness as knowing, but it's no knower or nothing known. It's knowing like this. Is an interesting reflection. So the space, earth, fire, water, and air couldn't exist without consciousness. You know, if there was no consciousness, there'd be no space. So space is in consciousness. Space allows form to manifest. Without space, how could we possibly manifest in these human bodies if there was no space for them to manifest in? So getting to the source is the conscious reality of here and now. As simple as that is, that's why ultimately paticca samuppada is very simple, very basic. It's not complicated like it sounds at the beginning when when most of us first started reading about the teaching, the translations of paticca samuppada in English. Nowadays, when I started, there was nothing, as I said before, in English except a translation of one of Jalkun Buddhadasa's teachings of paticca samuppada. And the translation wasn't very good, but it was all that was available in English. But even that was beneficial. I had tremendous insight just through investigating Buddhadasa's English translation. But now you've got Somdet Payutto, Prapayuto is a living sage in Thailand, and translated, Paticca Samuppada has been translated in his book Buddha Dhamma into English, which is very good, very useful, practical. So I recommend that. Prapayuto's English translation, or if you're Thai, you can read Thai. You can read the original in Tanputo's Buddha Dhamma. But these teachings, like the emphasis on Four Noble Truths, Paticca Samuppada, it's not to cling to them as kind of doctrines. They're not doctrines. They're directional signs. And the direction for all of us is here and now. And we're all experiencing here and now. Experience is now. It's like this. Whatever state of mind you're in, whether you're healthy or sick, whether you're happy or miserable, so when you take happiness and misery as personal, then it becomes avicca, bhajaya sankhara. So the world that we create is a miserable one if we're unhappy. It's a wonderful one if we're happy. But these are very unstable. There's not the deathless. It's all, even worldly happiness ends up in death. So I offer this as a reflection for this afternoon.